Hi everyone, very quickly let's cover tabes dorsalis. And this is a rare, slow-acting tertiary neurosyphilis condition involving degenerative changes in the dorsal columns of the spinal cord and dorsal roots. This is caused by Treponema pallidum infection. So this is basically a bacterial infection caused by this bacteria called Treponema pallidum. Now this bacteria causes a syphilis infection, particularly in the spinal cord and in the dorsal root of the spinal cord as well as the dorsal column of the spinal cord. So if you can recall, I told you that dorsal is the sensory root, ventral is the motor root. Dorsal root has a ganglion as well, and then they come together to form trunk, and then they divide further to form anterior posterior rami. Remember, and I told you dorsal root is primarily sensory and ventral root is primarily motor, and then the trunk as well as rami are mixed. Now what happens is that there is syphilis that affects the dorsal column as well as the dorsal root. So there's this a bacteria T. pallidum. It's going to affect the dorsal column as well as the dorsal root, and this will result in a lot of you know destruction and a lot of symptoms. So here you can see this just shows dorsal column, but also the interior and posterior horns are also involved. And you can see there will be loss of position and vibration sense below the level of lesion. So because dorsal column deals with, it's the most modern system, it deals with 2-point discrimination, and then proprioception, then vibratory sensation, sense of vibration, and then also the touch, light touch. Remember? Now, talking about tabes dorsalis, it's a late complication of untreated syphilis where the bacteria damage the posterior columns of the spinal cord, which carry sensation. Now, because of this, there'll be a lot of symptoms. You can read these symptoms from this book called Snell's. And let me just explain every symptom one by one. This is that the organism causes selective destruction of nerve fibers at the point of entrance of the posterior root into the spinal cord, especially in the lower thoracic and lumbosacral regions, especially in the lower thoracic and lumbosacral regions. So do not forget that. And the symptoms are stabbing pains are there in the lower limbs, which may be very severe. So stabbing pain is because of damaged sensory nerves, because the dorsal sensory root is damaged, so there will be damaged sensory nerve. There will be abnormal pain signals. Then there will be paresthesia with numbness in the lower limbs. Paresthesia is basically tingling. So there will be tingling, like feeling of pins and needles, and there will be numbness in lower limb. Again, that's because the sensory nerves are, the sensory pathways are damaged. So there will be abnormal pain signals. Then you'll have hyperesthesia. Hyperesthesia is basically hypersensitivity of the skin to touch, heat, and cold. So the person will experience exaggerated sensations of heat, touch, and temperature, heat, cold, and touch. So basically, this is hyperesthesia. Even light touch may feel exaggerated. Even light temperature, for example, if it's not very heated, it will still feel very hot. Then there'll be loss of sensation in the skin of parts of trunk and lower limbs, and loss of awareness that the urinary bladder is full. So loss of sensation. There could also be hyperesthesia, excessive sensitivity. There could be complete loss of sensation because of spinothalamic and dorsal column pathways affected. So because spinothalamic is affected, so there will be issues with touch, pain, and temperature. Because of dorsal column, there will be loss of 2-point discrimination. Because of it, there will be loss of position sense and proprioception. And the Romberg sign will be positive because the person cannot stand still. Sensory ataxia, unsteady walking because there's no proprioception because dorsal column is affected. Same with Romberg sign, it's positive because proprioception is lost. Loss of deep pain sensation. Muscles don't hurt even when they're compressed. That's because the deep sensory fibers are damaged. Hypotonia. The muscles have low muscle tone. Limbs feel floppy because muscle tone depends on the sensory reflex input, which is lost. Loss of reflexes, especially knee and ankle, because the reflex arc needs sensory input and dorsal dam is damaged. Ataxia worsens in dark, and then agile Robertson pupil, bladder problems because autonomic sensory pathways are affected. So all sensory loss plus poor coordination due to dorsal column damage.